Baines?
Hello, Baines.
Hi. I'm sorry. I'm having an issue here. Please continue.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Tell us your wardrobe malfunction, Baines. Hello and welcome to the Drunk Dog QUACKCAST. This is QUACKCAST number 452. I'm Ozone Ocean, and with me is Tansri and Baines. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. So we're talking about some very important social situations tonight on the QUACKCAST. No, we're not really. It's just being a dick. We're talking about the way stories have changed over the years. So storytelling styles have changed a lot. Now, I was just thinking this because Tans was talking about this great new TV series on Netflix called The Alienist, and tells stories in a specific way, as things do in the 21st century, specifically in like the 2010s. Stories now are told quite differently to what they were told like maybe 10 years ago, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. You really notice that. And I was just curious into people's perceptions about how they've changed. But, not just TV and movies, but, comics. If anyone can really sort of enlighten us about that. And we've just been talking about, in our Patreon video, our lovely patrons have donated to be able to watch. And we do this every week. We've just been talking about the way webcomics have changed. The whole so-called webtoon format has taken over. It wasn't, basically vertical scrolling, pioneered by Scott McCloud. And we're talking about how that has changed storytelling styles for webcomics. But before we get into all that, I have to bring up the featured comic this week, which QUACKCAST has done. And her featured comic was Full House by Project Nuts. So take it away, Kwai, with Full House by Project Nuts.
Hello, this is QUACKCAST, and the feature I've selected for this week is Full House by Project Nuts, written by Chappie, and it is rated E for everyone. Full House is a slice of life comic about two sets of siblings and their quirky arguments. One pair of siblings, Hakeem and Hakal, has a story that is somewhat meta, as the characters in the comic are currently in the process of creating their own comic. On the other side of the coin, we have Jill and Noah, a sister and brother team, whose dynamic is very close to the polar opposites. There is a joy in seeing how two complete opposite personalities can be so closely related. The comic art is in black and white, with cutscenes and color pages in color. Enjoy a world that showcases the relationships of siblings, and read Full House by Project Nuts, written by Chappie, rated E.
And that was the featured comic. Full House by Project Nuts. That's the whole title. Project Nuts is part of the title. It's not just by Project Nuts, it is Full House by Project Nuts. Alright. Next up is the featured music. Gun Wallace has given us the theme to The Jacket comic, which was the comic I featured last week. The Jacket comic. And I would describe this music as wiry, punk, gritty, shiny and cool. This one jangles in on lyrical chords, sounding indie rock with an almost Arabian flavor at times as the strings howl and echo up and down the scales. A rocky tune for the coolest jacket in the world. So, take it away, Gun Wallace, with The Jacket comic. That was the Jacket comic, Gumball's Theme, which is the comic I featured the week before last week, and the comic is by R.T.H. Hiddleman, which is the name of both the writer and the artist. Rated M, it's a good comic. Have a read of it. Superhero comic, but non-traditional. Okay, guys. Stories.
No jacket.
Yes, no jacket required. Susu Studio. I can feel it in the air tonight. I know all the tracks on that, bloody hell. Phil Collins. Great man.
Oh, okay.
Great man. That's actually one of the first CDs I ever got.
Phil Collins.
Yeah, well, my parents bought it for me. It wasn't my choice. I didn't even have any idea. It's just, they got that for me, and yeah, that was cool. All right. Let's talk about the style of storytelling and how it has changed. Now, we were going to talk about webtoon format and scrolling stuff, but we've decided to leave that only for the Patreon video. So, watch our Patreon video if you want to see what we think about that. Right, guys. The way storytelling has changed, or the way storytelling has changed a lot over the years. I mean, that is without question. It does. There are a lot of influences behind that. Yeah, basically fashion, I would say, is probably the biggest thing. I mean, obviously there's say Netflix has offered us the whole binge watching style that really sort of came in with Netflix. But that's a technical kind of issue. So yeah, we have the ability to stream stuff constantly, one episode after the other, and even cutting out the beginning credit, the opening credits and the end credits, just so you can move from one part of the story to another and have it as a continuous stream. So the biggest thing that caused was to have story arcs being a main thing. So episodic stories sort of started to go out of favor in favor of things that were more had a bigger overarching story arc and everything sort of joined together. You still have the episodic stories, but it was more of a focus on the whole overarching thing, which is not what you had from, say, stories in the 80s. Like the 80s are a good example, because you had so many great series from there. Things are way more episodic back then. So, and that is a change that happened just because of, the technological abilities of the format. But fashion and style are other things that influence it. Stories now tend to be a lot faster, don't they? There's so many things that characterize stories from now. We have social issues have to be addressed in some way. We have stories that show a lot more grittiness in social situations. We have stories that are more inclusive. So we have all sorts of different ethnicities and stuff like that are included. We're more aware of sexism in stories, so we have more inclusivity with the female characters, not being just sidelined. The female point of view is addressed more thoroughly in stories as well. So that you have those aspects, as well as stories being a lot faster. There's more focus, I think, on character motivation. I think I'm thinking that's a big thing now with stories. They focus on character motivation rather than just having an ensemble of characters and just showing a story set up through, okay, these are all these characters interacting. This is the story that these characters are in. Now we delve way deeper into character motivation. So say if you have an ensemble cast, what they'll do is they'll address a whole bunch of characters' backgrounds. So we'll focus on this character, we'll focus on this character, and focus on this character. And we we dive super deep into them in stories these days. That's a particular stylistic thing. Whereas in the old days, we didn't really dive super deep into the characters. You know, maybe we'd address stuff eventually as the series went on, or, you know, like with movies and stuff like that, we wouldn't ever go into a super deep dive. We'd only like superficially address characters. And now I feel that we often, like we look at childhoods of characters and how that influences how they're feeling now, you know, how that changes their point of view. That's a big stylistic thing. Now I've just been blabbing on, so yeah, go on, Tans.
No. Two things occurred to me as I was listening to what you were saying. The one thing is that although we have definitely moved towards a never quickening or speeding up, let's say, format of story pacing, like the stories, we need the stories to land while running, in a sense.
Yes, good points.
However, if we consider the way that we binge watch movies, not movies, series, and how series are very popular, we're going through, I think, a kind of a golden age of TV series, to be honest, not TV in general, but TV series. The way that we binge watch it is that we are basically watching movies that are 6 hours long, 10 hours long, and so on. So
yes,
it's not that we have lost the attention span, which is something I have heard audiences being accused of in general, like, okay, there is no patience anymore and stuff. It's the way that we parse this patience and the way that we want to allocate this patience. We want to see that it is worth our time immediately, and then we will invest our energy and time and immersion and devotion to these characters and this plot. Whereas in earlier eras, even when we go back, to 18th century, 19th century novels and stories, we tended, as I'm talking like as humans, as audiences, we tended to afford the time, even if it wasn't worth it, a lot more in the beginning. Like we gave it time. Whereas now we don't. And that is, I think, a function of the way society works in general. Earlier, you had more time to burn. So slow burns weren't as much of a problem because people gather around the fire a lot earlier. They had to, because winter season wasn't crop season, or because all sorts of things that gave people ample time in certain formats and in certain social classes, of course. Whereas now we don't have that. Our time is a more precious commodity than money itself sometimes. So we tend to want to know that we will, like, the biggest thing. Why are people angry at Game of Thrones? Because we invested 10 years of our I don't know how many years of our lives in something that convinced us that would be worth our time, and then it petered out and fell through, and it didn't pay off in the end. And that's the biggest transgression. Like the landing didn't stick; it crashed and burned. So, so in that sense, I think society drives a lot how stories are formatted and how stories are paced, and the focus as well. We are interested more in the background of the characters and the motivation of the characters and their childhoods and stuff, because we are progressively more and more acquainted with basic principles of psychology and basic principles of mental development. and what makes people tick. Although, in my opinion, to a very big extent, people are still psychologically illiterate. Still, they are more aware that these things exist and are necessary to know about these things, which we didn't say in the 20s or earlier, or even in the 40s and the 50s.
Yeah, we had to have very different appreciations of the way personalities are formed, and perhaps we didn't really care about those deeper psychological aspects.
Only after we realized that the lobotomy didn't work and there was no quick fix that we started being more serious about this. So there you go.
Yes. That is an interesting aspect of stuff. Are you saying we're like more intelligent viewers of things now than we used to be?
No, I think we are just more familiar with certain elements that have always been true and have always been true for stories. But we didn't require in order to accept certain things earlier on than as opposed and compared to the now.
Okay.
Of his or her characters and their backgrounds. Like, look at Les Miserables. Okay, Victor Hugo knows exactly and shows you as well how these people have developed and why they have developed the way they have, psychologically and socially. However, at the time, it wasn't really considered such a direct function of who you are being a result of your environment and your experiences. And in a way, Javert is what society thought at the time. You appear on this earth or fully formed. We have nothing to do with who you are. It's all your fault. So, and that drove, I think, also a lot of how characters were handled in storytelling. Like the writers may know why their characters are doing things, but they don't put this in the story because it wouldn't be considered necessary by the audience of the time, in a sense, to be engaged. Whereas now, more of that is required. People are more inquisitive about this, and they would like to know tidbits throughout the story about these things. Okay, so this is just my theory. I just see that there is a correlation around these things. That's all.
Okay, yeah, I suppose that fits. That's an interesting aspect. I mean, I find myself these days appreciating other aspects of stories that maybe I would have let pass. So say something like Game of Thrones, which I haven't seen, but other stuff like that, where they have sword fighting and armor and stuff like that. I find there's a Vikings, it's another show that people now are a lot more aware of historical aspects and costumes and armor and stuff like that. So people, this isn't a storytelling thing, I suppose, but people are more discerning and they expect stuff to be more, accurate, and they get annoyed by stuff they would have let pass. And as I say, that's not a story aspect, but I'm just relating it to the fact that, you have more discerning viewers, like what you're talking about with the viewers who are interested in psychological aspects. You're interested in other aspects that should be correct and shouldn't be just, weak and thrown together at the last minute. So it sort of goes all the way around that we're a lot more discerning. What about, say, in the past, stories were often big on tropes to make characters. Has that gone away, do you think, in some aspects, and we're having actual more rounded characters, or have we still got the tropes, so that's still a big thing?
I think like people are aware of tropes now
Yeah.
so much because of our history. I mean, a lot of the entertainment now kind of rests on the audience's knowledge of tropes and expectations of tropes.
Yeah.
And so the twist on those things becomes a lot more common.
Okay, so we subvert the tropes a lot more. Yeah, I've noticed that. And story styles, that's the thing too. So we don't have many stories that follow the old typical format anymore. The old typical format, a lot of them tend to twist it deliberately, so much so that it becomes a bit, annoying in some ways.
Yeah, I would say that now the tropes are being so consistently subverted that these are new tropes
Yes.
on the other tropes. So yeah, you have the the damsel in distress, and you also have the damsel in non-distress, in a sense.
Yeah.
They are two coupled tropes that are constantly, clashing or being juxtaposed. Or you have the knight in distress, or the guy in distress instead. So you do have, like, tropes haven't gone. They are just morphing into what is more popular and trendier now, just as it was before with the original tropes.
Yes, like the evil bad guy who's not really evil, who's secretly good, and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. Okay. Yeah. Demons are always good, you guys. That's how it is these days. And angels are evil. That's how it is.
Of course.
Yeah.
So now we are almost at the cusp of a new subversion of the subversion, and we will be back to where we started again.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay. So what the things that have changed, like speed of stories, as we were talking about, introduction of characters, character like psychology, that's become more real. Say, what about something that's specific to comics or web comics? Have you guys noticed a style of like storytelling in web comics that has changed? In
Storytelling.
Yeah, in the
format.
last 20 years. Not format. I mean, we did talk about like the vertical scrolling in our Patreon video. But just
that's
but not
exclusive there.
Yeah, not physical storytelling, but like other aspects of storytelling in web comics that have changed.
I think there is a lot of the divergence into several different genres that didn't exist before. Like there is a lot more variety in like different categories of web comics that at least I don't remember existing. I think they originally started off more or less like oh my god, I don't have the word right now. Strips.
Yeah. The first web comics were mostly strips.
Like Freelance, if you recall, and what was the other one? A few that were very long running pioneers and stuff. They started off more like strips, and then you had a lot of adventure, or not adventure, superhero adventure comics, sort of in the shadow of the big two, Marvel and DC. And then we veered off into the graphic novel area more than actual comics, in the sense of getting out like a volume or a book of 20 pages, 25 pages, and this is one volume, like a comic, and this is like an episodic thing. Like we don't do that in web comics as much. I think we are more towards a graphic novel thing, or the daily, either or.
Yeah, that's true. That has been a bit of a change. Yeah, a lot of webcomics in the early days, that when they moved on from doing the strips, were kind of predicated on the idea of, okay, I'm doing a webcomic, but actually what I really want to do is print. And so this is actually going to be a print format. And that's what a lot of people were sort of hedging their bets towards. And now that has sort of gone away largely and kind of split off into the people who do zines. Because I think zines were one of the earliest kind of webcomic style things. But now there's been quite a schism, and those people are just mainly doing zines. They don't care about webcomics anymore. So well, we've lost that from the world of webcomics largely, which is quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the traditional, as you were saying, you're saying like moving into more graphic novels, so like whole long form of that kind of storytelling. But I think a lot of the traditional page by page style webcomics have also changed a bit in their storytelling style as well. We still get page by page stuff, but it's a lot less like the print comic style than they used to be. So comics are much more quick in their style. So we have, fewer panels on pages. We don't have print style pages with a lot of panels and heavy dialogue. We have mainly characters filling the pages and a lot less of them. And, the word bubbles are also, not too big, not too small and not too restrictive. Just because I suppose that's the technical limitation of screens and stuff like that. You don't want to force people to zoom in.
I think also manga is becoming, or has become by now, a very big influence.
Yeah.
Not only in mainstream, but also indie comics and indie web comics in general. So the format and the pacing of stories in manga is completely different to the traditional, let's say, Western or European stories. If you take some of the staple print comics that aren't superhero ones, like Asterix or 1010 or Lucky Luke, all of these, their format is very, very strict, almost austere, you could say, in the way that they present the story. Whereas manga is a lot more fluid in the way of expression. The layouts can be completely broken if necessary to tell the story, or the layouts could be very unorthodox. You may not have a single panel that is oblong or square in a page. Or an entire page could be a drop of blood dropping from the wound to the ground, and that could be the entire page. So very a lot of investment in drama through pictures, and not as much with words in manga. So having that coupled with the Western, you get married products, I guess, of a bit of both.
Yeah.
Depending on the influence of every creator. So.
Yeah, it's a bit of a hybrid of the style. Yeah, that's interesting. There have been these kind of subtle changes over time. It's really interesting to see how that has, how it was morphed. So let's get back into TV series and movies, which is, something we can all relate to. How do you think movies have changed over the years? Because obviously, you were saying TV series, we can all point to the whole Netflix influence and the binge watching and arcs being a major thing versus short format stuff. And we've talked about that before on different QUACKCAST, arcs versus episodic as different formats of storytelling, which actually that has influenced webcomics as well, I think.
Totally, absolutely.
Yeah, people have gone way more into the overarching kind of story. But so movies, I think they also move a lot faster as well now in their style of storytelling.
Yes, generally it's that thing, I think, that there is this pressure for the movie to be engaging in the first, let's say, minute at the most of its runtime. Even better if it is in the first 15 seconds or 20 seconds. So in order to do that, there are techniques that the storyteller has to employ. That goes again for novels as well. You will see that it's very telltale in the first page of a novel. If you compare, and you can even almost tell when the decade it was written. That's how much of a thumbprint the first introductory page of a novel is. And the first paragraph itself is very, very telltale, because we want to immediately be convinced that this is worth our time. Otherwise, we will put it down, we will change the channel, we will search for something else.
Yes, because we have a lot of choice, so we're
exactly.
able to do that.
The multitude of choice
they're fighting for our
appraisal
eyes.
and sorting. So in that sense, I think the stories are generally, they tend to be very fast-paced in the beginning, and then they tend to have like a sort of lag or a slower pace in the middle, and then speed up again, rather than start slow and then speed up all the way to the end, which was another format for more vintage movies. If you happen to watch something like 1970s suspense films, they are very slow burns usually, and they keep upping the ante until everything starts just completely unraveling. Take it as you like either the story bursts into development or everything seems to collapse immediately after we go over the middle point. So
yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So I think, and whereas even earlier movies, I think, had a very standard pace, start to finish, rather than speeding up. They were almost like Princess Bride, in a sense, that they took their time, but in the sense that the pace didn't really change, even if the action was very intense, or even if things were highly suspenseful, the action itself, the pacing of the story wouldn't really change.
Yeah. What about, say, movies always had like a theatrical structure in that they had the acts, like usually 3 acts, I think, was the main thing. Does stories still have that now? Would you say in movies?
Yeah, more or less. I would say that everything moves in threes, in a sense.
Did you say something, Baines?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's there. Yeah, still that
3-act structure.
3 acts. Some people think of it as 4 acts, but that could apply to old movies as well as new. I think where your act 2 split in half. That's the longest, and you have sort of a midpoint split, and like those structural things I think are still there.
Okay.
I would definitely agree in movies and novels that you like older stuff, especially novels, would have a lot of world building. And Tans mentioned this, I think, on the Patreon video.
Yeah.
That a lot of world building would be allowed, and you'd see the entire environment for a long time before things really start going crazy. And that's basically a deal breaker now, I think, in novel writing, at least if you want to be traditionally published.
Absolutely, yeah.
Getting readers, too, like you kind of got to get to it right away. You have to have conflict right away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's still a stretch and then an acceleration of pace. You can kind of play with that, but you kind of do your world building bit by bit. You kind of have to jump into things a lot more quickly.
Yeah.
Actually, that's interesting. Say, there's the cinematic version of, say, The Lord of the Rings, and they dropped a lot of very important parts of the book. And you think, well, was that just because they were converting it to from a book into a cinematic version, or was it because they were fitting in with modern tastes? So we can't have the Tom Bombadil, we can't have the Scarron the Shah, we can't have this or that. We have to. There's this whole idea. If you ever watch, I'm sure you guys do. You watch the director's commentary or actor's commentary at the end of movies. Now, one thing that comes up again and again, what I hear is they talk about the editing and say, "Oh, we dropped this bit and we dropped that bit because we didn't feel that it, it facilitated the pacing of the thing." And we wanted to get to these next scenes, and we thought this was running a bit too long, or we expanded on this B story a bit too much, and it was sort of taking away from the main storyline. So we got it out, and everything is subservient to this idea of pacing and moving forward. We don't have time to sort of go on to different directions. We have to just go straight through. And I'm thinking perhaps older things didn't sort of feel that way, didn't necessarily feel that everything is subservient to that main beeline towards the end, towards the climax. A lot of older stories, they did let you kind of, noodle off into these side paths, at least briefly.
Oh, yeah. Especially, this is, again, as I said, evident even in short stories and stuff, how the info dump trap that we are trying constantly to avoid, and rightly so, was actually part of the whole ritual of storytelling for earlier versions of storytellers. Like you had literally the omniscient narrator explaining to you what you're getting into. Once upon a time, there was a king and queen in this so-and-so kingdom, and this happened. This is info dump. However, it was expected, and people wanted to know that in advance and then get to the action, being educated in a sense, or at least that's what they were used to, and felt that it was good enough for them to enjoy the story. Whereas now, we don't want someone to go once upon a time. We want to have the king having an argument with the queen, and we want to learn everything through the argument. I'm married for this kingdom that exists here, and your other kingdom that I hate, blah, blah, blah. And now we are in this conflict, and I want to send you to a nunnery. We have our story. Okay.
It's all outlined.
So, it's the packaging that changes more than anything.
Well, there's
the same bit of information.
Yeah.
Just different packages.
Well, there's pluses and negatives to that in that when obviously info dumps can be very boring and get on your nerves, but often in stories they're so parsimonious with the detail that you end up being confused and not properly invested because you just don't understand why this person doesn't like this person, and what this kingdom even means, and when is this set? Because you just haven't been given enough information. What this jargon means and stuff like that. So there's a bit of a balancing act with that kind of stuff. You can't be
I think it's just to be spread more throughout the story. I mean, you want your conflict, not necessarily a fight or a huge kind of violent conflict or something like that, but some kind of conflict from the get-go to be invested in. Yeah. And then your world building, again, will be spread out among like several chapters. You learn new things as you need to.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Those important things. I mean, it is interesting that there's so much left upfront description that's desired.
Yes. Well,
like Ken said, that used to be the conventional, like always the way it was.
Yeah.
So that's kind of rule number one to not do.
Very much so. It reminds me of this story by the famous writer E.R. Edison. So he was one of the Inklings, a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien and all that crowd. And his famous story was The Worm Ouroboros, which is a fantasy story. Basically Tolkien wrote his Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe series, and Tolkien had his Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and stuff like that. E.R. Edison had his Worm Ouroboros, so that's one of the big early fantasy stories. But compared to those other ones by those two writers, which they don't really have much framing, the Worm Ouroboros is very old-fashioned in its framing. It massively frames it in a very traditional sort of way, hugely traditional, and it took me a lot to get through that. I had to force myself. I read through it, started reading through it, and then I just gave up because it was just too heavy on the detail and too heavy on the setup, massively heavy. And it took me 2 tries to get through it because it was so mind-numbingly boring with the amount of setup and detail and describing every little gleam on the gem on this guy's goblet as he sat down for the feast, and this character, and he sat down, and then this character, and then talking about his wives and his relationship to the rest. It's just, that is a really good example of a massive info dump. But it was worth it to get through it because the story itself was, it lent me another perspective on the whole way people regarded fantasy back then in the time of C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien when they were originally writing in the 20s or the 30s, that kind of thing. And this story was a completely different take on fantasy in that, Tolkien with his style of storytelling, in fantasy back then, because the style was more, gentle, I suppose. If you're reading Tolkien, there's that idea that it's for children, but it was really, for everybody. But there's a bit of an innocence to the way he tells those stories, and they're very much from a male perspective, from an empire perspective, from an upper class perspective. And C.S. Lewis, again, they're from that, child's point of view, upper class privileged, that kind of thing. Whereas E.R. Edison's style of telling a story was far more Game of Thrones kind of thing. People point to what's his name and his style of writing and say, he pioneered this dark, this gritty style of writing. Who's the guy who wrote Game of Thrones? Okay, no one remembers.
George Martin.
R.R. Martin, yeah. So they're saying, this is his style. He pioneered that. But E.R. Edison was writing that, 50 years before this guy ever picked up a pen. Very, very dark, kind of gritty kind of stuff, where you're worried about characters and, very much that style, which is it's quite interesting to think about, because when you're thinking about stories written in the 1920s, 1930s, you sort of think, oh, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, blah blah blah. That's how they all wrote. But no, there was a bit of a variation. So yeah, that's why I bring that up. Anyway, sorry for that sidetrack. I just thought that would be it's an interesting thing. So not when we're sort of thinking, okay, stories, style of telling stories has changed over the years. There are always exceptions. Not every story from a particular age all follows the same kind of style. We have, say Doctor Who these days. Doctor Who is told in like half-hour episodes, and they're very self-contained episodes. They have a story arc, an overarching story arc, but they're told in like 23-minute episodes, something like that, I suppose, or half an hour. In the old days, back in the 70s and the 80s, Doctor Who was told in half-an-hour stories, but they were like arc stories. So they had a 6-episode arc or 7-episode arc. So that, again, interestingly, sort of presupposes this whole modern idea of having stories over an arc. You know, they didn't have a series arc, but they did have like an episodic arc, I suppose. Like, so it's like 6 episodes together. So yeah, an exception to that whole you know, stories are in us. You know, you can tell where a story is from by the year.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, there's that.
You'd
Nice.
have continuity and story arcs of that kind way back too in newspaper strips. I have some collections of old strips from 1930s,
Okay.
beginning in that era, and they would, you'd have these long running things, sometimes for months, sometimes most of a year. You'd have this long running like Little Abner story.
All right.
So many times the first panel would be filled up with exposition, explaining everything in shorthand, where you're at to get there. So it's kind of funny to see them all together, where you'd have to quickly get people up to speed, every day.
Yeah.
For anyone who just picked up the paper that day.
Um,
But and a lot of repeated panels, just to reintroduce the conflict, and then you'd only have 3 panels to do that day's story, basically.
Wow.
I remember now that you mentioned it, a big reason why the format is so strict and rigid in the Western European comics, like Tintin and I think also Asterix, is because they originated as long-form strips on newspapers.
Right.
And then the story was pieced together into a book. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
of course, you would have, 4-panel tiers throughout.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's why they're stacked like that in a whole big grid pattern and don't tend to have much variation outside of it. I know, like Asterix, obviously exploded out of that, and they would always have their splash panels for the feasting scene on the wild boars and, various stuff like that. But they did tend to be, quite strictly gridded, and Tintin or Tantan or whatever you call it, even more so. That was extremely gridded to the point where when you read those stories, you have to change the way you think in order to sort of become accustomed to that. I feel, because that's very, very gridded up. It takes a while to sort of get used to it, I think. How about you guys?
I didn't catch that, to be honest.
Tintin is quite strictly gridded in its style.
Oh, yeah.
And it takes a long time to get used to that when you're reading it, I find. Especially if you're used to more modern styles of comic pages. it's hard to get used to a whole page full of gridded comic stuff.
Yeah. It also is very wordy on occasion.
Oh, yeah.
Like you have really big balloons with a wall of text in it.
Yeah.
I never had a problem with that because basically these were the comics I first saw. Like my first comics were Asterix and Lucky Luke, and then I acquired my first 10. So those were my initiators in a sense. So I never really had a problem with that. But the other layout never was an issue either. So.
All right. Well, I grew up with, say, Asterix, and that has a nice big bold style. And then getting into Tintin is quite a culture shock because no longer do you have line variation, all the lines are the same thickness, and panel variation. There's a bit of panel variation in Asterix. There's a lot less in Tintin. So yeah, it was hard for me to get into. Well, that's another aspect. A lot of these, story style changes are based on what audiences expect, but they're also what audiences are used to. So that means when story styles begin to change, everybody has to do it because people are used to what's current and what's popular, and they have a bit more of a negative reaction to stuff that doesn't fit with that. If something is too retro or too different, it's not going to gain much ground, is it? So everybody all has to move along. Have you seen many stories that, the other day I was getting into this Netflix series, Silver Spoons it's called, which is a Russian police action comedy drama, but it's Russian in that it's not an American thing set in Russia. It's actually Russian language with, subtitles. And it's quite older style to Western eyes because it's way more episodic than you would get in, a Western thing these days, which is a lot less episodic and more towards the arc. This thing still had an arc to it, but it had far more of a completion at the end of an episode that I feel a lot of Western stuff does these days. And I found that interesting. And it's Russian, so they don't have to follow the same strictures as all this Western stuff does. All this American stuff and English and whatever that has to sort of, have the same format. And Tance, I was just going to ask, you watch a lot of Korean stuff. Do you find differences in the storytelling there?
Yes and no, depending on the category. The Korean, there is a difference. There is a very a very significant qualitative difference. Actually, two. The first one is that the action is presented together with a lull, if you can imagine what I mean. So you have this very intense scene that's happening. It is super suspenseful. It has you at the edge of your seat. You cannot really tear your eyes off the screen. And then at the same time, fishtailing between scene and the other one I'm going to describe, you have a sort of respite, like short breath, because parallel in time in the storytelling, you will have a quieter scene or a humorous scene taking place. And you have little, almost like sketches that are intermitted in between the very suspenseful, very serious scene that's happening, which allows the viewer to to have balance and to be able to take 40 minutes of extreme intensity.
Right.
Because they have these little tiny breaks, as like the screen cuts to the other guys that are doing something that is still relevant to the intense scene, but it's removed in tone a lot from it.
Yeah.
But it's still intense in the sense that it is relevant to whatever it is that is happening. Like I'll give you an example. So you have let's say you have these the good guys have a microfilm and they are rushing to take it to a particular point from where they will be able to they rush to take it to a courthouse because it's evidence, for example. Okay, and it is a huge chase, insane traps that are happening, and the whole episode is them getting from point A to point B because it's extremely hard. They have to troubleshoot all the time. They have to problem solve. They have to change things. Okay. In the same time, the people that are supposed to stall the courthouse hearing so that they can get there in time and submit the evidence are the change of pace and the change of tone that also, however, contributes to the suspense. So you might have a small humorous scene of the guy trying to, with some antics to stop the continuation of the session in court by, for example, pretending that someone stole his wallet or something like this and causing a commotion, like a pickpocket, like this in the courthouse, having to interrupt the courthouse hearing for a while until order is restored and everybody stops panicking, for example. This might be slapstick that is a tone relief. But you also know, okay, they have earned another 10 minutes.
Right.
For the other guys. So, and then we're back to the other guys that are still rushing and moving and stuff. So it's like breaking the surface of the water to take a breath and then you just dive back in. And that is the Korean format in a lot of things, not just a suspenseful action movie or series, which is just an easy example to make. You could have this in Korean soap opera, for example. You have the very intense clash between, the love triangle, and then you have the couple that are, the satellites to the triangle, and they don't have in that game still, doing certain stuff that you are interested in, and just breaking up the pace a little bit. And that the effect of this is that you walk away with the impression of having one smooth continuum, start to finish, of intensity without being emotionally and mentally exhausted once it is finished.
Yeah,
right.
And that
focused on one particular thing completely all the time. You have little breaks and all that works. That's a good kind of way of doing it. I think they do that in Western stuff sometimes, but it's not such a it's not such a big thing. They'll do the A story, B story kind of stuff, but often that is action here, action there, rather than taking a break from.
No, so A, B, and it interchanges. It is never action and action. It's action in action, or different kind of action. And the other thing that I guess also contributes to the pacing is the acting school that they have in Korean TV and film. They do that in both genres. They emote a lot, like their face. They convey a lot of things without talking, just by their expression, which is not something I see very much in Western acting. Like there are a lot of there are actors that will do that, but most you hear like almost theatrical stuff, like with projection of the voice and posturing more than anything. Whereas Koreans go more for the expression and the emotional connection, the emotional language gets across.
So you're saying Keanu Reeves, Ryan Gosling, and Scarlett Johansson could not get jobs in Korean films.
Not very easy, no.
My pet hates the wooden-faced actors.
Only as stunt doubles. They could.
They could play trees. This has been an interesting talk on Star Wars story and how it has changed over the years in everything, in all the different stuff. We're sort of just getting towards our time now. So any final thoughts, guys?
Just I want to wrap it up by saying what I said about the acting. It contributes to the pacing because they don't need the time to talk to convey the message. So a scene might be a lot shorter because of this.
Right. Yeah. They don't
so the pacing is faster.
That's sad. Yeah, it's just it's totally the reaction. And if it's done well, that can really help a scene. Or if it's done badly, say like I think that the actress was Toni Collette in Hereditary.
I haven't seen it yet.
Overdoes the facial movements so much so that she out emotes everybody in the entire film, and it's hilarious. That's a really good example of bad over emoting. I urge everyone to see it just to watch Toni Collette overact.
Yeah, that's the theatrical stuff, I think. It's the method, the Blackadder method of acting, as in Blackadder the Third. You know, how far should the nipples be?
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening to QUACKCAST number 252.
Thank you too.
Cool.
Thank you kindly. All right. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Go on now.
Let's mosey on into the sunset.
Yes. Let's go eat. I'm hungry.